It doesn't matter where you go in the world, when people think of Scotland, they think of the kilt. It's literally the most Scottish thing there could be. The question is though, why is this? So what led the kilt to becoming such an integral part of Scottish identity? Well, before I answer that, first you've got to remember to subscribe to my channel. First things first, nobody knows for definite when the kilt was invented, but the first iteration of it is believed to have evolved in the 16th century out of an outfit called the plaid. Now, the plaid, known in Gaelic as the brat, had been a common fixture in the Scottish Highlands since the Roman times. Nobody really knows where it came from or how it got into the Scottish Highlands. Some say the Irish Celts, others the Romans, but in the 16th century, for whatever reason, it evolved into the Great Kilt. Here's the thing though, the Great Kilt, also known as the belted plaid, was not the kilt as we know it, and nor was it per se linked to Scottish culture. It was mainly worn by the Highlanders, who were very much a minority in Scotland, but even the Highlanders themselves only wore it for practical reasons, so it wasn't a fashion or cultural statement. You see, the weather in the Highlands is treacherous, and the thing about the Great Kilt and its predecessor the plaid is that not only can it act as a cloak to protect you from the rain and snow, but it also makes for a brilliant blanket to keep you warm at night should you need it. That means yes, the Great Kilt was all about functionality, and it was actually the desire for functionality that saw the Great Kilt get transformed into the kilt as we know it today. So the small kilt version, you see, in the 1720s, English Quaker Thomas Rawlinson teamed up with Clan MacDonald chief Ian MacDonald and set up an iron smelting foundry near Inverness. However, Rawlinson's business immediately started having difficulties with its workforce, but not due to rebellion or anything like that, due to the Great Kilt. You see, the problem was the Great Kilt was cumbersome in design, and trust me when I say this, if you were working in an 18th century iron smelting foundry, that would be the last thing you would want. Needless to say, the Highland workers in Rawlinson's foundry had a real need for a more practical outfit, which of course led Rawlinson to enlist the services of a tailor in search of such an outfit, and the result was the invention of the small kilt, which is basically the bottom half of the Great Kilt, but with the fabric turned back on itself and sewn in to make it narrower and more of a solid unit. Now, I should add at this point, some dispute whether Rawlinson was the true inventor of the small kilt, and the evidence is shaky at best, but regardless of whether he did or didn't, it doesn't change the fact that the most likely reason for the sudden popularity of the small kilt was due to it being the most practical design for early 18th century Highland workers who were increasingly stepping into an industrialized world. And I know what you're thinking at this point. How do we get from this, so factory and mill workers from the Highlands preferring the outfit, to it becoming a symbol for Scotland, which it absolutely was not at this point. Not even close. In fact, it was seen as the outfit of backwoods savages, and not just by the English, by most of the Scottish. Yep, I'm not joking on this. You see, for the majority of Scottish history, kilts and their predecessors plaids were mainly worn by Highlanders, who were, as said, very much the minority in Scotland. It was those from the lowlands that made up the majority, and they saw Highlanders as backwoods savages. In fact, the contempt by ordinary Scots for Highlanders was such, they even had a term for them, redshanks, and trust me when I say this, that was an extremely derogatory term. But out of this disdain, rather crazily, comes the story of how the kilt became synonymous with Scotland, and it's all linked to the crushing of the Jacobite movement. You see, to explain, the Jacobite movement has its roots in the glorious revolution of 1688. This was when the Catholic monarchy led by King James II was deposed. Now, without going into any great detail, this basically set in motion much dispute over who should rule Britain and Ireland, and the Highlanders sided with the Jacobites, who were a wide accumulation of different groups of people from throughout Britain, Ireland and France, all of whom wanted the deposed House of Stuart back in charge. And this desire to bring the House of Stuart back led the Jacobites to launch a number of rebellions, the last of which came in 1745. It was called the Jacobite Uprising, and the Highlanders played a big part in it, which was unfortunate because the uprising was crushed resoundingly in the legendary Battle of Culloden. And of course, this inevitably led the Highlanders to pay a heavy price, namely the Dress Act of 1746. This act, which was enacted by the British Parliament, made Highland clothing, including the kilt, illegal. The idea behind the act was to force Highlanders to adopt the culture of the lowlanders, and the hope was it would persuade them to finally leave behind their over half a century long obsession with the Jacobite movement. So basically, the British government hoped that by erasing Highland culture, it would get the Highlanders on side, and surprisingly, it sort of did. You see, over the next few decades, despite sporadic protests protest, the Highlanders largely left behind their old ways and got on board with the rest of the country. Now, I should add that this was probably more down to the Industrial Revolution than anything else, which came into full steam in the second half of the century. But the point is, they largely left their ways behind, which meant the kilt was gone, and it likely would have remained gone if not for this one fact. You see, the 1746 Act had come with an exemption. That exemption allowed for Highlander military regiments to continue wearing the kilt, and this reality saw the kilt start to become synonymous with the Scottish military, and through it, nobility and bravery. So basically, writers of the day started using the military link to romanticize the image of the kilt, and this image transformation led to a number of the Scottish aristocracy to start pushing for the Dress Act to be repealed, which happened in 1782. And the moment it did happen, those who had been pushing for it started dressing in the kilt, while simultaneously setting up societies and clubs which were solely focused on promoting the general use of Highland dress, which they weren't even really promoting, you see. They were promoting the small kilt, not the plaid or the great kilt, which were the true ancient Highland dress styles. But regardless of this minor detail, eventually the romanticising became so widespread that by the time Sir Walter Scott, who was a Scottish author and historian from the period, was tasked with navigating the 1822 state visit to Edinburgh of King George IV, he insisted that all should wear Highland dress in their own family tartan. He did this because he believed there was such a thing, but there wasn't, and nor had there ever been. It was a fiction, but that fiction was about to be made real. You see, those who had been invited to the party, whether they wanted to or not, now all had to get full Highland dress made up, and they had to create their own family tartans, which they of course did. But they weren't alone in doing this, you see. King George IV himself turned up in full Highland dress, so tartan and kilt, and the moment he did this, the tartan and kilt became the main fashion for the Scottish gentry. Not the everyday people, that's important to note, just the gentry. But as is always the case, once rich people start wearing something, the image becomes cool, which is exactly what happened. That means, rather crazily, the reason the kilt became a symbol for Scotland is because it got banned, but through that ban, it got linked to the military and so nobility and bravery. The Scottish aristocracy then stepped in to try to grab some of that nobility and bravery for themselves. Fiction then stepped in. Some started believing that fiction to be real, and the rest, as they say, is history. That's all from me. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this, remember to give it a like and subscribe to my channel, because the more who do so, the more of these short histories I can make. Is that a good bribe? I hope it is. I'll see you next time.